Hello, I'm Gordon Lang, editor of CameraLabs.com. In this video I want to show you around the new flagship Olympus digital camera, the OMD EM1, and here it is right here. Now before I go any further, I want to just make a note that this is a preview video, it is not my final review. This is a pre-production camera, so I can't talk about image quality. It should be out around mid-October 2013, so if you're watching this video after that date, then please go to CameraLabs.com. If you're watching this video on YouTube, there'll be a direct link underneath the video that will take you direct to my full review of this camera, which will have image quality results, comparisons, all of that sort of stuff. So this is just a preview video to show you the new features. Now this camera does not replace the OMD EM5, which I have in my other hand here. This remains in the range as a lower end model. The EM1 is actually officially the successor to the E5. Now the E5, the E series, was what launched the original 4/3 format. Now these were DSLRs, these were not mirrorless cameras, and Olympus brought out a number of really decent lenses for it. In fact, 23 of them, including some really high quality telephotos and fast zooms. Now, when they introduced micro four thirds, one of the first things they did was bring out a small adapter which would allow you to use those older lenses on the new bodies, but the autofocus performance was never very good. So what Olympus has really concentrated on the EM1 is improving its autofocus when you're using those older lenses. And I have one of them right here. This is the 12 to 60 f2.8 to 4, which was a really popular kit lens for the E5. It's a really nice lens. Now, what Olympus have done is, for the first time on an Olympus camera, is integrate phase detect autofocus points on the sensor. It's a new sensor, I'll tell you more about it in just a minute. So what they've done, like a lot of mirrorless cameras, it's a hybrid AF system. It has phase detect autofocus and it has contrast based autofocus, which is what they used before. But there are some conditions. Now if you attach a micro four thirds lens to the EM1, then the autofocus is contrast based for single AF and a mix that they weren't very clear about explaining, a kind of mix between contrast and phase detect for continuous autofocusing. If you mount one of these lenses, an old 4/3 lens to it, then it switches to its phase detect autofocus system for single AF and continuous AF for stills. So that surely gives you the best of both worlds, right? Well, it does, but there's one little catch, and that's that, unfortunately, the phase detect autofocus system does not apply to movies. When you're recording video, whether you're using new micro four thirds lenses or old 4/3 lenses, it goes back to a contrast-based system for micro four thirds or manual focus for 4/3. So it's a bit of a shame that Olympus have a kind of neglected video in this respect. So great for stills, but not so great for video in terms of continuous autofocus. It's going to be pretty much the same as the older models. Okay, so that's the autofocus taken care of. Now let's take a closer look at the sensor. Now they've kept the resolution to 16 megapixels, so it's the same as the EM5 before it, but there's a couple of major differences. The first is obviously those integrated phase detect AF points, but for the first time Olympus has also now eliminated the optical low pass filter, which should hopefully make those images look a little bit crisper. And it's also coupled with a new image processor, and that includes software correction from Huawei, and also some new lens corrections as well. It will now eliminate or reduce chromatic aberrations for Olympus lenses, not for Panasonic ones. So it's very much like a Panasonic camera when you attach Olympus lenses to that. It will only correct its own manufacturer's lenses, but it's quite nice to have that in there anyway. Now, obviously, like other Olympus cameras, the sensor is mounted on a shifting platform, which allows it to support stabilization within the body. Now, the stabilization system on the EM1 is described as being the same as the EP5. So that means it's a little bit better than the EM5. It's still a 5-axis system, so I mean, regardless of how you're wobbling this camera, it should be able to stabilize it. If you are reading the specs, though, you'll notice that Olympus now describes it as good for 4 stops, and that's because they now use official CEPA measurement conditions, so that's why they've had to knock it down a stop. But basically, if you thought the EM5 was good, the EM1 is even going to be a little bit better. Now, like the EM5 here, it is dust and splash proof, and Olympus also describe it as being a little bit tougher as well. But new to the EM1 is the fact that it is now freeze proof down to -10 degrees Celsius, which is nice if you're shooting in very cold conditions. Now the thing is with weatherproofing is that you need a weatherproof lens, and there's still only a few weatherproof micro four thirds lenses. But it turns out that all of the micro four thirds lenses and all of the 4/3 lenses from Olympus are already freeze-proof down to -10. So you can put any of those lenses on. Be careful about dust or moisture if they're not weather sealed, but they are all effectively freeze-proof. So that's quite nice to have there. Now I want to show you around some of the actual design features of this camera. It's obviously chunkier than the EM5. It's quite a significantly bigger camera. It's got a much larger grip, which feels really, really comfortable, I have to say. And there's also a new optional battery grip for it as well. It's got twin control dials. It's got a rather neat on-off switch, which really harks back to how the rewind lever used to work on 35mm film SLRs, which is there. The mode dial here has got quite an interesting lock on it. It's got a button on it, and like a lot of cameras, you'd think, oh, I need to hold that down to turn it, but that's not the case. It actually turns freely until you press the button in, and then it's locked, and then you press the button again, and it unlocks it, which is pretty nice. If I switch the camera on using its new switch here, I'm going to show you one of the new modes on this, which allows you to adjust the color on the camera. It's quite a nice new interface they've developed. If I press the function button here on top of the camera, you'll see a circle appears on the back of it. Now you can then use the front finger dial to adjust the hue of the image, and then you can use the rear dial to adjust the saturation, so you can take it right down to the center to turn it to black and white, and back up again to get a really highly saturated image. What of course you can also do is if you turn it completely to black and white and then change the hue, you can effectively apply different black and white filters to it. So this isn't really anything that you haven't seen before. You can do that with color controls on cameras, or obviously on your RAW files afterwards. But this is a really nice new interface that they've brought to this. Looking around the camera, on the front, there's a PC sync port here for connecting to external lighting. It's also the first Olympus camera, finally, to have a microphone socket for an external microphone. There are adjustable levels on this, but unfortunately there's no meters on the screen, so you're kind of adjusting it a bit blind, which is a bit of a shame. There is only a single SD memory card slot. I know that a lot of people were hoping that it would have twin SD memory card slots. Sadly, that's not the case. Although, if it's any consolation, it uses the same battery as the EP5 and I think the EM5. Now then, in terms of composition, you've got the choice of a tilting screen on the back. Unfortunately, this does not fully flip out. Its new panel, though, is the same as in the EP5. It's 1 million dot LCD, and it does look quite a lot crisper than that on the EM5. But for me, one of the biggest and most significant upgrades over the EM5 is the viewfinder, which has gone to pretty much the same panel that you'll find in the VF4 accessory that's for the EP5. This is a really incredibly detailed viewfinder. It's I think it's over 2 million dots, but the image is big. You know, it's really, really large. It's roughly the same size as a full-frame DSLR's optical viewfinder, and significantly bigger than the view that you'd get if you were using the old E5. So that's a really, really nice upgrade in that respect. So if you decide to upgrade from the EM5 to the EM1, you'll notice that the viewfinder does look a lot better. It's really large. They've also slightly modified it to give a more natural colour than the VF4 did on the EP5. And they've also implemented an automatic brightness control as well. And you can disable that if you don't like it, but it could be something that makes the switch from an optical viewfinder, such as that on the E5, to an electronic one here more palatable. But as soon as you start changing that colour mode that I just showed you, to think, oh, I love electronic viewfinders, you know, then they're not all bad. This is a very, very, very nice viewfinder. Suffice it to say, there's also a detector on the back that will turn the screen on and off if your eye goes up to it. Now, like the EP5, it has built-in Wi-Fi. Sadly, no NFC. Clearly, Olympus is not on the same track as Panasonic and Sony in that respect. They don't think you need NFC to simplify the initial Wi-Fi negotiation. They've got their own system, which is really clever. We saw it on the EP5. It actually displays a QR code on the back. You just point your smartphone camera at it, and when the app's running, it actually knows what the password is. It actually can work it out just from that QR code. So it's not that big a deal not having NFC on this camera. The Wi-Fi implementation would appear to be similar to the EP5, until you start up the newly enhanced smartphone application. Sadly, I can't show you that now in this preview, but I have seen it working, and it now gives you complete manual control over exposures, which you could not do with the EP5. Sadly, that updated app does not suddenly now equip the EP5 remote control with manual control over exposures. It's only the EM1 that supports that. And it even supports their live bulb feature. This is where, when you're doing long exposures, you can actually take a peek at the picture as it's building up and stop it if it already looks fine, or stop it if it's already ruined. Why waste your battery and your time? You can now preview that effect on your smartphone over Wi-Fi. So this camera could be outside in the cold, taking pictures, or maybe taking fireworks, and you can see exactly how it's getting on your smartphone, which is a really, really nice feature to have. Moving on, wrapping up some of the remaining specifications. The continuous shooting is now 10 frames per second with single AF, or 6.5 frames per second with continuous autofocus, and both of those speeds are a little bit faster than the EM5 and the earlier E5. It also has a 1/8000th of a second mechanical shutter like the EP5, which is very useful, not just if you're shooting fast action, but if you're shooting with very bright aperture lenses outdoors. You know, I regularly bump up against the 4000th fastest shutter speed on this camera when I'm using an f1.8 lens, and it's so nice to be able to get that extra stop on your shutter speeds. It also has focus peaking like the EP5, but like that camera, it's only for stills, not for video. You keep thinking, wait a minute, they don't do it for video, just like the phase detect autofocus. It's like Olympus is not taking video that seriously, certainly not compared to Panasonic. They're very much still focused on stills. It has an interval timer like the EP5, but where the EP5 was limited to just 99 pictures, which is pretty useless, the EM1 now lets you go to 999 frames, which is obviously much more useful, although I'd still fancy more, just greedy really. There's an HDR mode on it, but new to the EM1, it will actually assemble those pictures in camera, and you can have two different effects, either fairly subtle or not so fairly subtle. And that about wraps it up. Now, there are, of course, some other things about this camera. There's some new lenses as well. You'll see here I've got it with the new 12 to 40mm f2.8. It's a constant aperture lens. You may be thinking, wait a minute, that's similar to the Panasonic 12 to 35mm f2.8. Difference here is, of course, this is 5mm longer. But the Panasonic has optical stabilization, so if you've got a body without stabilization, that might still be preferable. I don't yet know the price for that lens, but the body is going to work out approximately $1,499 US, or about 1,500 euros. I'm going to have more accurate pricing on my more in-depth preview at cameralabs.com. And that's where you should head right now, because this was just a very brief overview of what this new camera's got. I've got a lot more detail and analysis, even now before the final review is finished, over at cameralabs.com. And once again, come mid-October, when this camera is available and fully evaluated, that's also where you'll find my full review. As always, I'd love to hear what you think. Put your comments on YouTube or on any of my social channels on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter. I really look forward to hearing from you.